My name is Elena Marchetti, and I'm 38 years old. For 10 years, I was married to a man named Thomas, who gave me everything except the one thing I quietly ached for the entire marriage. He never once touched me, not intimately, not in the way a wife expects from her husband. He was tender in every other sense, attentive, generous, endlessly kind. But a wall existed between us that I never fully understood and never found the courage to fully confront. I spent a decade believing something about myself explained that distance. I never imagined the truth would arrive 7 days after his funeral, folded neatly inside an envelope that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about the man I loved. And about 10 years I'd spent quietly grieving a version of myself I believed was somehow unlovable. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, a police officer's careful, practiced voice explaining that Thomas had jumped from the observation deck of a building downtown. That witnesses described no hesitation, no note left visible in his belongings, nothing anyone could point to as clear warning beforehand. I remember very little about the days that followed, a blur of funeral arrangements and casseroles left quietly on my porch by neighbors who didn't know what else to offer someone in my position. What I remember with total clarity was sitting across from his estate lawyer a week later, a composed woman named Ms. Alvarez, who informed me, with careful gentleness, that I had just inherited $400 million, an entire empire of real estate holdings and investments I'd never once known existed during our whole marriage together. To understand how I could be married to a man worth $400 million and never know it, you have to understand the strange, careful architecture of our marriage from the very beginning. Thomas and I met when I was 26, working as a receptionist at a firm where he consulted occasionally, a quiet, watchful man who courted me slowly and thoughtfully, never once rushing anything between us. We married within 2 years, and from our wedding night forward, something in him held back in a way I couldn't fully name or understand. He'd hold me for hours, memorize the exact sound of my laugh, remember every small detail of my day without fail. But he never once let intimacy move beyond that careful, deliberate tenderness. When I asked, gently at first, and then more directly as the years passed, he'd change the subject, or simply say, quietly, that he loved me more than I could possibly understand. An answer that explained absolutely nothing, and somehow ended every conversation regardless of how many times I tried again. I spent years turning that unanswered question entirely inward, wondering constantly what was wrong with me, whether I wasn't attractive enough, desirable enough, whether some invisible flaw in myself had built that wall between us without my even realizing it. Friends assumed things about our marriage they never said aloud, but implied through careful, pitying expressions whenever the subject arose naturally in conversation. My own mother once asked, delicately, whether Thomas simply preferred men, a question I'd turned over privately more than once without ever finding real evidence to support it either way. I stayed anyway, because everything else about him felt like genuine patient love, constant, even as that one unanswered question grew heavier with every passing year of our marriage. In the days leading up to the funeral, that unanswered question became entirely unbearable, tangled now with fresh grief and a growing uncomfortable awareness of how little I actually knew about my own husband's private life. Relatives I'd barely met arrived from cities I didn't even know he had ties to, speaking casually about business ventures and properties I'd never once heard mentioned in 10 full years of marriage. His longtime assistant, a woman named Priya who'd worked for him for over a decade, kept glancing at me during the service with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, something caught between grief and guilt, as though she knew something about him that I never had access to myself. I sat through that entire funeral surrounded by strangers who apparently understood pieces of my husband's life I'd never once been shown, and the weight of that particular realization sat heavier on me than the grief itself did. Looking back now, I can see clearly the clues I'd dismissed for years without ever fully assembling them into any coherent picture. Thomas kept a locked drawer in his study that he never once explained, a small metal box he checked quietly some evenings, always returning it carefully before I noticed for too long. He maintained a private phone line I was never given the number to, one that rang occasionally late at night, prompting him to step onto our back porch to answer it, his voice always too low for me to make out any actual words. Twice a year, without much explanation, He traveled alone for exactly 3 days, always to the same undisclosed location, always returning quieter than when he'd left, sometimes limping slightly for a day or two afterward, before that limp mysteriously disappeared entirely. I'd asked about those trips once, directly, and he'd simply said, "Medical appointments, nothing serious." An answer vague enough that I eventually stopped pressing him further, though the vagueness itself had always nagged quietly at some corner of my mind. I chose not to examine too closely. 7 days after the funeral, exactly as specified in a set of instructions he'd apparently left with Ms. Alvarez years earlier, she arrived at my door carrying a sealed envelope with my name written carefully across it in Thomas's familiar handwriting. She explained that he'd left explicit instructions for this particular letter to be delivered exactly 1 week after his death, no sooner and no later, a request she'd honored precisely, despite never fully understanding his exact reasoning behind it. I sat alone in our living room that evening, the same room where he'd held me through countless nights without ever once crossing that invisible line between us, and opened the letter with hands that wouldn't quite stay steady. The letter began with an apology, immediate and raw, unlike anything I'd ever once heard from him while he was alive. He explained that 11 years earlier, before we'd even met, a serious car accident had left him with an injury that made physical intimacy essentially impossible, a medical reality he'd been too ashamed, too proud, and eventually too afraid to ever fully explain to me directly. He wrote that he'd fallen in love with me anyway, certain at first that he could find some way to tell me the truth before things became too serious between us, and then increasingly terrified, as the years passed, that revealing it would mean losing me entirely, or worse, trapping me in a marriage built on pity rather than genuine love. The private phone line, it turned out, had been his specialist's office. The twice-yearly trips had been experimental treatments he'd quietly pursued for over a decade, treatments that ultimately failed one after another, each failure deepening a private despair he'd never once let me witness directly. The letter's final pages explained the fortune itself, an entire real estate empire he'd built almost completely in secret. Driven, he wrote, by a compulsive need to give me something enormous to compensate for what he felt he could never physically give me instead. He'd left everything to me deliberately, hoping the inheritance might offer some measure of the freedom and joy he felt he'd quietly withheld throughout our entire marriage together. His final words explained the jump not as an act of despair over me specifically, but as an act of surrender to a full decade of private shame and repeatedly failed treatments he no longer had the strength left to keep hidden. An ending he'd apparently been quietly planning for months, timed carefully to ensure I'd be financially secure before I ever discovered the truth behind it. I sat with that letter for hours afterward, my grief transforming shape entirely as I reread every single page. 10 years of perceived rejection reorganized itself instantly into an act of quiet, devastating protection. A love so afraid of becoming a burden that it chose distance instead of vulnerability every single time. I felt real anger alongside the grief. Anger that he'd carried that shame entirely alone for so long. Anger that he'd never once trusted me enough to let me choose for myself. Whether pity, if it even existed the way he feared it would, might have mattered far less to me than simply knowing the truth all along. In the months that followed, I established a foundation in Thomas's name dedicated to funding accident recovery research and mental health support for people navigating exactly the kind of private shame that had ultimately taken his life. I used a significant portion of the inheritance to endow scholarships at the hospital where his failed treatments had quietly taken place, ensuring future patients received not just medical care, but real psychological support alongside it. Something he'd apparently never once been offered during his own decade of quiet, isolated suffering. I understand now that love sometimes looks absolutely nothing like what we expect it to. That silence can be its own devastating form of devotion, chosen entirely out of fear rather than indifference. I spent 10 full years believing something was fundamentally wrong with me, when the actual truth was simply that the man I loved was fighting a private battle he never once found the courage to fully share with me. If you've ever misunderstood someone's silence as rejection, only to discover later that it was actually a desperate, misguided attempt to protect you. Instead, you already understand exactly what that letter felt like sitting in my hands. and exactly why I'll spend the rest of my life making absolutely certain no one else has to carry that kind of secret entirely alone again.